Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to, in fact, the last of our autumn series on the theme of secret bucks. And this time we're sort of slightly broadening our focus. Although the Special Operations Executive had a number of installations in Buckinghamshire, Chittersley Hall, Fawley Court, Grendon Hall, and so on. Our speaker tonight is going to focus on what has become really a particularly well-known aspect of SOE's operations, which is going to, as you can see, focus on female secret agents in the Second World War. I'm delighted that we're being joined by Professor Juliette Pattinson. Juliette is Deputy Director of the Division of Arts and Humanities and also Professor of Modern History at the University of Kent. And she's also a trustee of the Secret World War II Learning Network. She's the author of a number of books, Behind Enemy Lines, Gender, Parsing and the SOE in the Second World War, Women of War, Gender, Modernity and the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, co-author of Men in Reserve, British Civilian Masculinities in the Second World War. She's preparing at the moment a book on editing a book on humour in the Second World War, and a slightly longer term project is to work on a more detailed history of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry in the Second World War. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce to you Juliette Pattinson.
Thanks ever so much, Ian, and thank you so much for inviting me to come to talk to you this evening. So the title of the talk is Carve Their Names with Pride, Female Secret Agents in the Second World War. And I'm sure the title probably resonates with so many of you. And as we'll see from the next slide, Derek, this comes from a really popular biography by R.J. Minnie of a female secret agent during the Second World War called Violette Zabo. She was had Anglo-French heritage. Her British father married a French woman after the First World War, as we'll go on to see, so many of the agents. She married a Frenchman and they had a daughter. He was killed at El Alamein, and she went on to join an organisation that recruited men and women, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, the organisation called the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. And this female agent, Violette Zabo, was a courier who infiltrated into northern France. She was kind of based in Rouen, and on her second mission she was captured after a gunfight, allegedly, and you can see lots of the front covers of the biography depict this gunfight, and she was awarded the George Cross essentially for posthumously, obviously, as I'll come on to say, because she covered the escape of her French colleague Jacques Dufour, and she was taken captive. She was sent to a concentration camp called Ravensbrück near Berlin, and she was executed along with other female agents, and I'll come to talk about that. But the biography, it really made, I think, Violette Zabo a household name, and even more so the film that came out in 1958, starring Virginia McKenna. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that Violette Zabo has basically stood in for many of the other SOE agents. So this is a memorial on the Albert embankment that was, Karen Newman was the sculptor, and this was unveiled in 2009, I think it was. And even though this is a memorial to the whole of this organisation, which, as I'll go on to say, operated throughout Western Europe as well as in the Far East, it's really interesting, I think, that they have chosen to represent the organisation by picking arguably the most well-known SOE agent. And the reason why I think she's so well known is because there has been this, I think, public fascination with the female agent in particular. She's not the only one, and you can see in the memorial, it says at the bottom, their names are carved with pride. So it's playing on the biography and the film, the phrase that's used there to represent all of SOE. And if we go into the next slide, Violette was, as I mentioned, somebody that's, I think, very well known. Another woman who has become even more well known more recently, I think, Noor Khan, who was also posthumously awarded the George Cross. This is a memorial to her in Gordon Square by the same sculptor, Karen Newman, and that was 2012 that was unveiled. And there's actually been quite a lot of focus on Noor Khan. She's off. This memorial itself was actually the first memorial to an Asian woman in Britain. So there has been a lot of focus, I think, not only because of her gender, but also because of her ethnicity. So these two women have become, I think, really quite well known. There are numbers of schools, for example, that name their forms or classes after these female agents. But there is, I think, a lot of knowledge about them. There's been lots of television programs and radio programs about them. And so what I want to do today is kind of set them into kind of context, really, by talking about the female agents. I'm going to talk a little bit about the recruitment, how an organisation came to recruit women like Violette Zabo and Noor Khan. I'm going to go on to talk about their training, and this is the kind of overlap with your county, and then we'll move on to thinking about infiltration into France. I'm going to be focusing on France because this was one of the few parts of the organisation that did recruit women in relatively significant numbers. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about their operational missions and their strategies for not being captured, and then talk about the experiences of those that were arrested, and then just a little bit about kind of post-war representations. So to kind of loop us right back to this focus on this public fascination with the female secret agent. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, we'll think a little bit about how this organisation came into existence. So this is, if we think about the summer of 1940 and what's happening, we've obviously had the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. We've got the Battle of Britain happening, and a recognition that having had the invasion of the Low Countries and of France, that Britain is likely to be next. And also a recognition, I think, that in order to fight the Nazis, you have to play them at their own game. You can't be kind of gentlemanly about this. And so what we begin to see is the recognition of ungentlemanly warfare. And that ungentlemanly warfare can include women, as we'll see. So Hugh Dalton wrote to Lord Halifax, "We've got to organise movements in enemy-occupied territory comparable to the Sinn Féin movement in Ireland." So I think that gets across the controversial nature of this type of warfare. This isn't how it's done. This is not cricket. This is deliberately using underhand techniques. It also refers to the Chinese guerrillas now operating against Japan, to the Spanish irregulars who played a notable part in Wellington's campaign, or, one might as well admit it, to the organisations which the Nazis themselves have developed so remarkably in almost every country in the world. This democratic international must use many different methods, including industrial and military sabotage, labour agitation and strikes, contiguous propaganda, terrorist acts against traitors and German leaders, boycotts and riots. So if we move to the next slide, we can see how we then have a war cabinet memo in which this new organisation is being established to coordinate all action by way of subversion and sabotage against the enemy overseas. This organisation will be known as the Special Operations Executive, and you can see that document at the National Archives at Kew. Okay, so how then do we get to an organisation that is deploying ungentlemanly warfare to fight the Nazis, to an organisation that recruits women? And if we think about, this was a time before, certainly in July 1940, British women were not fully mobilised. You don't get the conscription of British women coming in until later in the war. But that actually, with their mobilisation in the National Service No. 2 Act in December 1941, enables women to be deployed to take on action. So women going into the WAF, the ATS and the RENS. And so what we have from 1942 onwards is the recognition that women could be used. Although we have this kind of cultural taboo, a combat taboo, so the notion that it's kind of unseemly to ask a woman to take up arms to fight for the nation in this period, there is this kind of, it's not a legal prevention, it's a kind of a cultural unease that women would be deployed in such a way. But if we move to the next slide, what we see is the second recruiting officer for part of the SOE, and saying in his interview that was held at the Imperial War Museum, I was responsible for recruiting women for the work in the face of a good deal of opposition from the powers that be, who said that women under the Geneva Convention were not allowed to take combatant duties, which they regarded resistance work in France as being. There was a good deal of opposition from various quarters until it went up to Churchill. Well, that's not correct. As I mentioned, there is no legal basis for this. So the Geneva Convention doesn't say this. It's just it feels distasteful to get women to take up arms in this way. But what is so interesting, I think, is that during the Second World War, Britain goes further than any other nation in deploying women. So conscripting women, basically compelling them to either go into the industry, to go into the auxiliary services, or to work in civil defence. So Selwyn Jepson was the recruiting officer for F section. So SOE is the organisation has it's organised by different countries. So there are different sections based in each country. France is unique because there were 4 sections, and the one that was British led was called F section. There was also RF section, which was the Gaullist section, which recruited French nationals who kind of flocked to de Gaulle and fought there. But F section is the one that was British run. It was the section of SOE that deployed women in quite considerable numbers. So Selwyn Jepson is saying that it was him that convinced Churchill that this was the right thing to do, because of the assumption that women would have this cover, that male age, groups of men would look suspicious, whereas a woman with a man or women on their own would not be. So the decision was taken then, a controversial one, to begin to recruit women for this organisation. 39 women were sent in, but more would have been recruited, but just didn't pass the training. And I'll talk a bit about the training in a minute. But let's look a bit more at some of the motivations of these women for enlisting. So if we move to the next slide, we can see that Yvonne Baseden, who is one of many of the people that belong to this organisation that I interviewed, and she said, Jepson said to her, would you be interested to do something more in relation to France? Of course, I was thrilled, and I said, yes, of course. He said, it's not going to be very easy, and you'd have to leave the WAF for a little time, and you'd have to have special training. And I said, I don't mind. And he said, well, of course, the thing is, there are different ways of getting you over there if you're found suitable. It might imply parachute or landing. I said, well, that all sounds quite exciting. And at that point in the interview, she started to giggle. And I think that's really interesting. It's almost as if, you know, this woman who was, I think, probably about 78 when I interviewed her, was almost kind of reliving that recollection of being invited to do this. And she said it was, yeah, particularly exciting at that age. And she was, I think she was 22 at that period. So she said, okay, and that's how it all started, 1st of June 1943. And Yvonne was like Violette Zabo, actually. She had a British father and a French mother. And when I interviewed her, she talked about inheriting cultural attributes that she felt enabled her to pass as French in France. And I'll also come back to that. She also could, she was fluent in French, obviously. She'd had French schooling, she'd holidayed in France. The kind of cultural attributes that people might pick up. So the way of using cutlery is quite different in France than it is in Britain. So whereas in Britain we might have the fork in our left hand and the knife in our right, in France you might put your knife down, put your fork into your right hand, and you kind of scoop food up that way, or you might pour the last bit of your red wine into your soup tureen and pick up your bowl of soup. So there are, you know, kind of habits that are seen as distinctively French or British. And so somebody who is being raised and inculcated in a particular kind of national way of the fact that she'd inherited her looks, her fluency from her French mother, but also those other things. And some of the agents also talked about knitting, for example, being differentiated by you know, the British way of knitting and the French style of knitting. One of the men I interviewed talked about how he marched and was he was alerted to the fact that he marched like a British man, and he needed to learn how to kind of unthink that. So Yvonne was seen as somebody who had the right levels of linguistic proficiency. She said that she had the looks of a French person, you know, olive complexion, brown eyes, brown hair, and then those other things such as the habits that I've just been mentioning. So she was very excited to leave the WAF, where she was a wireless operator, and begin her training. And I'll talk a little bit more about the training in a minute, but let's think a little bit more about motivation. So on the next slide, we've got another of the female agents, Pearl Witherington, who actually recommended Yvonne that I interviewed because they were both serving in the WAF together. And that happened a lot with recruitment, both for the men and the women. It was the kind of old boys network or an old girls network. So if they knew somebody that had the French linguistic skills, then they would recommend them. And actually there was one family of, and we'll come back to this, of 2 women and their brother that were part of this French section. But Pearl Witherington, in her interview with the Imperial War Museum, kind of was reflecting on what motivated her to join. And she said, there's this question of being so mad with the Germans. I didn't like the Germans, I never did. I'm a baby of the 1418 war. There was the question of trying to do something useful for the war, but it was also, the biggest part of it was, I think, this fury that I had against the Germans, because I really was mad with them. And that the First World War comes up as a recurring motif in a lot of the testimonies, whether it's written or oral, and it certainly came up in the interviews that I conducted with male and female SOE agents. They've been brought up by men who had fought in the First World War, who had uncles that had participated and possibly had been killed. And I think that again, cultural inheritance of kind of trauma from that period. So there was, you know, I think it's really interesting. We've got fury and mad being mentioned here in her Imperial War Museum interview. So this was an opportunity to do something useful, as she says. And women were just as susceptible to this kind of patriotic rhetoric as the male agents that I interviewed were. But there were other areas as well. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see Jos Mordegemeke, and actually she wasn't an agent from the French section, she was a Dutch national, and she was recruited by the Dutch section. So France, the French section infiltrated 39 women. The Belgian and Dutch sections interviewed just 2 or 3, so very, very small numbers. But what I think is really striking here in this interview, and why I wanted to include it, and this is Jos pictured here, receiving a medal after the war by Queen Wilhelmina. You didn't think about being a woman at that time. That was not important. They needed people, and I wanted to help. I couldn't do anything else. And that certainly came across with many of the female agents that I interviewed, that gender was irrelevant to them. They didn't appear to be conscious of the fact that they shouldn't be doing this, or that it was extraordinary for them to be doing this. They just had the opportunity that presented itself, as we saw with Yvonne, and they stepped up. And then after the war, as we'll see, they stepped back down. Okay, so let's have a look at some more motivations. And we now come to, in the next slide, Yvonne Commando and also Violette Zabo, a quote from her. Obviously by 1946 she'd been executed, so we need to handle this with some caution, but we've got these 2 women who are saying that they were motivated because their husbands had been killed. So Yvonne Commando's husband had been killed during the Blitz. And she said, I think this was something my husband would have liked to do, and as he was no longer there to do it, I thought it was time for me to do it. And Violette allegedly said, it is my job. My husband has been killed. He was killed at El Alamein. I'm going to get my own back somehow. So this sense that in a time of war, there is this gender contract, this notion that men step up to fight and women remain on the home front, and this idea that we get emerging in the First World War of waiting and weeping. And that was obviously used by propagandists to compel men to volunteer prior to conscription coming in. Here what we've got is that these men are removed, and that creates a vacuum in which their wives feel compelled to step into their place to fight for them. This, I think this is a really interesting thing, because quite often we think of both of these women were mothers. So Violette Zabo was a mother to a very young daughter, Tanya, and Yvonne Commando also had children. And we often see motherhood as being kind of the antithesis of combat. You know, one is giving life, one is taking life. And yet these women are motivated because their husband has been killed. They're motivated by revenge, but also for their children. And we see this most explicitly on our next slide, which is the other, I think, very infamous female agent who was also awarded the George Cross, Odette Sansom. You may know her by her other name, Odette Churchill. And in her Imperial War Museum interview, she said, I used to say, well, I've got children and they come first. It's easy enough to go on thinking that way, but I was tormented. Am I going to be satisfied to accept this like that other people are going to suffer, get killed, die because of this war, and trying to get freedom for my own children? Let's face it. So am I supposed to accept all this sacrifice that other people are making without lifting a finger in any way? And so her 3 children that are pictured with her here when she's receiving her George Cross. So first of all, it's the fact that she's a mother that, you know, she's not interested at all, but actually that in the end is what motivates her to join this organization. So really interesting things going on there about what motivated the female agents. It's about revenge, it's about being brought up in the shadow of the First World War, it's about stepping into the vacuum left by their dead husbands, and it's about their children and wanting to liberate. So Odette was actually French, who had married a British man, so she actually assumed his nationality, so she wanted to liberate her home country for her children. Okay, so they would have their recruitment interview with Selwyn Jepson, and if he felt that they had the appropriate skills, then he would recommend that they move on to undertake training. So if we move to the next slide, we can see just this is kind of where there is this overlap, I think, with Buckinghamshire. So SOE is sometimes jokingly referred to as the stately homes of England, and actually the reason why is because the agents, when they were undertaking their training, would be based in these beautiful stately homes all across England, but also Scotland. So they would go through a series of training schools. They would start at Wombre Manor in Guildford, and this is where they would learn a bit of everything, really. So a bit of practice with various weapons and plastic explosives. So do a bit with the radio, wireless sets. They would do some physical exercise. And if they were seen to have the appropriate skills, then they would go to the next level of training, which would be in Arisaig, up in the west coast of Scotland, and this is where they're kind of out in the Highlands, trying to live off the fields essentially, and cope for themselves. So it's kind of a toughening up, and then they would also go to what is now Manchester Airport, was Ringway, to undertake their parachute training. Those that have been identified as having the skills for wireless operating, so women like Yvonne Baseden, she would then go through more training as a wireless operator to make their speed, they would increase the speed of which they can send and receive wireless messages in Morse code. So this was all in kind of groups of 5 that would then be transmitted using the B2 set. Leo Marks, the code master for SOE, wrote a really interesting book where he's talking all about the coding section, and this, I think, is where the overlap really comes, because as a slight diversion, these female agents in training, even though Yvonne, for example, was a member of the WAF, she then was put into fanny uniform. So fannies were the first aid nursing yeomanry, and this was chosen as a kind of cover organisation because nobody really knew about the fannies. So despite the fact that they're the oldest women's organisation, and they're still operational today, so they celebrated their centenary in 2007, and the book that Ian was introducing me to you by, I published a book last year, War, and that's about the formation of the first aid nursing yeomanry and their First World War service. I was actually meant to be writing a book about the Second World War and the SOE fannies who were based at Grendon, at Poundon, Chichley, also in North Africa, in Italy. Some of them went over to Ceylon, and some actually were going out to Australia, but the war ended. So these SOE, the fannies, were a cover organisation for the SOE agents, the female SOE agents, but also the fanny recruited these kind of upper class or upper middle class women who could be trusted to keep secrets, who would then, after their kind of initial fanny training, would be either coders or wireless operators, and they would be based in these stately homes, receiving the wireless messages in the field from the SOE agents, and then the coders would obviously be decoding the messages. And the interviews I conducted wasn't just with the SOE agents and the headquarters staff, it was also with the fannies. So I've got this wonderful collection of 44 interviews with SOE fannies that I'm yet to do anything about, but they're a really rich source, and I will be, I'm halfway through writing a book, but that was a long time ago and I need to return to it. But they've just got such wonderfully rich memories of their time at Grendon, which was called Station 53A, which I believe is now a prison, Poundon, Station 53B, and Chichley, and it's everything. It's about the that their memories are about the camaraderie with the other women that were there. It's about the intimacy of being online, as it were, in the Second World War, on what the wireless sets, in communication with agents, even though it was in code and they didn't know what the messages were about. They talk also about their kind of social lives as well. So being, going out locally. So it's a really wonderfully rich repository that I'm going to delve back into and talk, write more about. So yeah, the SOE agents would go through all of these. So Chichely, for example, I think that was Czech agents and then Polish agents that were based there. So yeah, if we move on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about the training. But what I want to show you is a clip from a film. This is called well, it was originally called School for Danger, and it featured a real life male agent, a man called Harry Ray, who'd been a school teacher, and a real life female agent called Jacqueline Nairn. And she was, well, basically, for the purposes of this RAF film, which was filmed in 1944 in the liberated towns and villages of southern France, it's a composite story. So we hear about recruitment and we hear about the training, which is the bit I'm going to show you, and then they go on a mission. But it wasn't released until a few years after. So it was filmed in 1944, and yeah, it came out several years later, and it came out as Now It Can Be Told. And actually, it was too late because it had already been told. It'd been told by the Americans, it'd been told by the French. There's a film called Rue Madeleine, and a number of others. So they completely missed a trick here. And actually, it came out to dreadful reviews, really, really critical of the stilted acting of these real life agents, because it's very much in the tradition of British documentary filmmaking. This is realism. We see this in British films during the Second World War. So a lot of, if you think about the work of Humphrey Jennings, for example, instead of using actors, they use real people, and that gives it some kind of authenticity and intimacy. But obviously these people are speaking their lines in quite a monotone voice often, and that was really picked up on by the by reviewers. So let's listen to this sequence, and it will take you through the training that they underwent. Oh, Derek, we can't hear that, I'm afraid. Can you unmute?
Went on a 30-mile walk across country with only a map and compass to guide us.
There was a theme song for our course. Je tire ma révérence. We used to make up unprintable words to it, in French, of course. Then we joined the parachute school. The balloon jump was the worst.
Jumping from an aircraft was better. Somehow, the noise of the engines made me excited.
Then we went to another school. This really was a school. I mean, we had lessons. The instructors were like smooth young university dons who'd taken a course under Pimpernel Smith or Raffles. They told us in the most gentlemanly manner how to organize our private lives as saboteurs, how to burgle a house, how to get out of handcuffs. They told us almost apologetically about lethal tablets, suicide pills, to be taken only as a last resort.
We made notes about organization and personal security.
Learned how to recognize all ranks of the German services.
Told how to use codes.
How the BBC sent personal messages during the French news.
The organization of the Gestapo.
Until our brains reeled under the load of information. At another school, we were taught how to organize reception committees. That's local people who'd collect in a field the night the RAF were coming to parachute supplies. With electric torches, they'd guide the planes to the field. Then there was a radio device called the Eureka, used to guide an aircraft to us from 20 miles away. And there was the S-phone, kind of wireless telephone on which we could talk to pilots, or to anyone who might fly out from London.
Then I started work at the wireless school, transmitting, receiving, coding and decoding, Morse, Morse and more Morse. I dreamt in Morse. I even started knitting in Morse.
We had a week's intensive lecturing about the weak spots in the industrial system of occupied Europe. The railway network was included in this. We were shown how we could hold up supplies by cutting the line at the right place. Another weak spot was the electric power supply. We were told to attack transformers wherever we could. It was evidently no use blowing up pylons, as they could be repaired too quickly. Railway engines have their weak spots too. Quite a small charge in the right place can put an engine out of action for months. Sometimes people had to be got out of occupied Europe in a hurry, by air. The RAF told us about the pattern of lights for the flare path, and the type of field they'd need for a landing ground. We finished our training with a scheme, which meant we were sent off separately with forged British identity cards.
I was dropping my wireless set 10 miles from a town. Had to make my way in, get lodging, and transmit messages at regular intervals.
I was given the necessary papers to get a job in a large munitions works. I had to bring back plans of secret plant to prove that I'd got past the guards. Half an hour after dropping us, a signal was sent to all police services in the area that a parachutist had been dropped, believed to be a German agent.
We got away with it somehow, but when we came back, we were put through a fierce interrogation.
And although we didn't know it at the time, questions were being asked about us in London.
The Gestapo had been having a roundup.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting film that does kind of take the agents through this period. So I mentioned about Womber Manor, I mentioned about the training B schools up in the Highlands, parachute training at Ringway, additional training if they were going to be a wireless operator, and then they went to Beaulieu for the finishing school, and that's where some of the agents, well, once somebody told me in an interview, that's where you were trained to be a secret agent. So it's all about secret ink, and then talked about the use of cyanide pills, and they went on this scheme where they were to put into practice everything that they had that they'd learned. Then of course, if they passed every stage, and people would be dropping out at all stages, not selected to go forward, if that was the case, they would be taken to Inverlair, where they'd go to something called the cooler, where basically they were to forget everything that they'd been that they'd learned. And what I think is so striking is that some of the female agents were halfway through the training before it dawned on them what they'd actually signed up for. So there's one female agent who said that she was a secretary and she'd answered an advert, and she's spoke French fluently and had made her way through the training. She's there thinking she's learning to, or this is for a job interview to do with her secretarial work, and she's there working with Sten guns and Bren guns and plastic explosive. Yeah, they are being basically taught in a whole range of armed and unarmed combat techniques, but some of the agents, it wasn't made clear to them what they had signed up for. Some of them were told very explicitly in the recruitment interview, but not all of them were. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And I think what's so interesting is the fact you have British Army instructors who are training women in the use of these techniques, and that's something that obviously they never had to do before. Ladies, it will be my unwelcome and embarrassing duty to teach you other and less refined methods of disabling would-be aggressors. I have never before had to teach such things to ladies. And that's said by the instructor, and it's bottom right. And it's, oh gosh, what's his name? I think it's Bill Owen, that was in Last of the Summer Wine, plays the instructor in Carve, Her Name with Pride. And then the images at the top, sorry, so they're from the film that we've just seen, School for Danger, or Now It Can Be Told. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, This is actually from a newspaper article in the post-war period where Yvonne is talking about some of her training. I had to blow up some railway lines. I was rather fond of explosives and did it effectively. Then there was weapons training. We handled everything from anti-tank guns to continental automatics. At the end of the course, I developed a great affection and a lot of skill with grenades, the Bren gun and the Colt 45 revolver. So I think really interesting that in the 1950s, which is in contrast to other representations, as we'll see right at the end of the talk, you know, she is talking very explicitly about learning to kill and enjoying it. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, we can see that the training reports, the personal files of the agents, men and women, are all at the National Archives in Kew. And some of the female agents really took to the training, really enjoyed it and were very good. Others, however, were seen as nervous with weapons, lacking in aggressiveness, pretty scared of weapons, too nervous to become a reliable shot. So a whole range of responses to something that was quite different. Juliette Zabo, that I started the talk with, she apparently would go to fun fairs and shoot for targets for cigarettes. So she obviously knew how to use weapons. Others would never have picked up a weapon previously. So this was a new skill that they were developing, and some took to it and others did not. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see some other training reports. And again, I think it speaks to the tension of these male army instructors being confronted by women who many of whom were not really cut out for this kind of training that they were trying to teach. Yolanda Beekman was seen as a nice girl, donned the men's socks, would make an excellent wife for an unimaginative man, but not much more than that. Francine Agazarian was temperamental, might blow the gaff in a fit of jealousy, might be indiscreet in a fit of pique, sometimes exhibited temperament and caprice, moody, jealous, unattractive to men. Yvonne Fontaine is egocentric, spoilt, stubborn, impatient, conceited and anxious to draw attention to herself, hair worn loose in rather unbecoming disarray, liable to frequent alteration, no doubt, very large goggly eyes, likes a great deal of attention from those whom she is pleased to call les boys. And Anne-Marie Waters will not hesitate always to make use of her, and I'm afraid I can't see the rest of that quote because it's come off the slide, but it's basically it's to do with her appearance, so manipulating her physical attractiveness. So some really, you know, interesting training reports to look at with 21st century eyes. You know, obviously that would be just absolutely would not happen today, but certainly this is how many of the female agents were seen by their male instructors. Okay, let's move on then. And this, we're now talking about infiltration. So they've been recruited, they've been trained, and now they're being infiltrated into France. Sometimes it was by Lysander plane, and this is the small plane here that would land on a airfield that had been identified in a French field, and then the agents would get out, it would turn around and then take off. So it's very small, you know, was able to do that. And then others parachuted in, as we can see from this last image, which is again from the film Now It Can Be Told. And if we move on to the next slide, the first few days of being operational in France was obviously when they were a bit jittery. This is the first time they're testing out their false identity documents, their ration cards, whether it would be recognised that they were different. And Yvonne Baseden that I interviewed said, well, of course, that was something I was worried about in case it happened, which it didn't. One always thought you're so obviously from another world. I felt that it must be noticed that I was different to everybody else. Of course, I looked very French anyway in those days particularly. You were conscious of being different in this group of people. So this sense of sticking out like a sore thumb is also a recurring motif in memoirs and oral testimony. So Devaro Rochester in her autobiography said that her heart flipped and started to thud against my ribs. I also felt a little sick. And it's often when they are confronted by German soldiers for the first time, this is when their passing as French is being tested for the very first time. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll see some other recollections. The next day I walked self-consciously about. I imagined I stuck out like a sore thumb. It took me nearly 3 weeks to shake off this form of self-consciousness and get over the idea that I had British agent written all over my face. and then she loses that sensation of being an outlaw, and that, I think, that cumulative confidence that builds after each successful and successive passing performance. So, you know, German soldiers checking their identity documents at a checkpoint, they aren't seen as different. They then begin to feel confident. Sonia Butt in a television documentary, lots of talking heads, and she's one of them. After being there a week, it was just a way of life. But the first time I saw Germans in uniform walking up and down the street, I was petrified. But then you get used to it, and you get used to how you have to behave with them. And if we move on to the next slide, so this notion of sticking out like a sore thumb or British agent, like flashing light bulbs, goes away very quickly. And there is a kind of gendered division of labour, essentially, that the organisation deploys. So men were infiltrated as network leaders. No women were infiltrated to lead the organisation, and I think this is partly because French women obviously didn't have the vote in this period. They don't get it until 1944-45, and it was you know, a largely Catholic country, and there was, I think, the presumption that French men, local French men, would not take orders from a young British or whatever nationality she might be woman. So women weren't network leaders. Both men and women were wireless operators. So women like Yvonne Baseden that I interviewed, Yvonne Commando that we've heard from, and one of the reasons why it was felt that women were particularly good is because, again, huge stereotype, but smaller fingers, a delicate tap on the wireless key. Men only were infiltrated as saboteurs, and women only were sent in as couriers. And as this file notes, girl couriers were used extensively because it was a fact that women were rarely stopped at controls, and only during the period immediately before the liberation. And even then, rarely were they searched. They were seldom picked up in mass arrests. They provided excellent cover for their movements about the country by visiting friends, carrying out shopping expeditions, and later foraging. And again, I've lost the end of it, but it's basically foraging for food. So they could, you know, they could be on their bike in the countryside, looking at different landing sites, but ostensibly it would be as if they were out shopping or using the accoutrements of being a housewife, being a mother. And there's lots of examples of French women who were in the resistance who would use a pram, for example, and they would, you know, a Sten gun would be under the baby, or parts of the wireless set would be there. Very difficult to pass off a wireless set as anything else. So it was often women that would try to take the wireless set across a checkpoint. And quite often they would use particular strategies. So if we move to the next slide, we can think about some of those strategies. So Sonia Butt said, you just react to the moment and think, I'll get by all right with a nice smile. I just sort of smiled and waved to them, these German soldiers, all the time. Women could get by with a smile and do things that men couldn't. And no matter what you had hidden in your handbag or your bicycle bag, if you had a nice smile, you know, just give them a little wink. It just happened constantly all the time. So I got away with it. You flirted automatically. That was just par for the course, just sort of went into the role automatically, just quite naturally. And obviously that was something that they were never told to do in their training, but so many of the female agents, SOE agents, but also female resistors, so local French women, were deploying femininity for clandestine purposes. So yeah, using accoutrements, shopping baskets, prams, pretending to be with a boyfriend, but actually it might have been somebody that they were helping to pass down an escape line, for example, flirting with German soldiers at checkpoints so that they wouldn't be searching their baggage, their suitcase, which might have resistance. Well, it could be, you know, said weapons or wireless sets. So that flirtation becomes this really interesting way of duping German soldiers who are really slow to realise that women were politicised. And I think, again, it comes down to the fact that not only did French women not have the vote here, so they were slow to realise that, but if we think about German women's role in this notion of the three Ks, Kinderkirche, that women's place being in the home, and seeing women in a particular way, that they were slow to realise that women were involved. I would say it was at least late 1943 when that became so much more apparent. Okay, so let's move on and just give you another example. Nancy Wake, in a biography written about her, she's quoted as saying, "I played the part of a giddy French woman who didn't care what happened in the war. I was a good time girl. I used to give Germans a date sometimes 3 or 4 if I was away on a long trip, and give them a little bit of hope. I played the part. I should have been an actress." And then later on she says, "I would just look over to the officer, flutter my eyelashes and say, 'Do you want to search moi?' And they would laugh flirtatiously. 'No, mademoiselle, you carry on.'" And if we move to the next slide, we'll see, these performances of femininity were often successful. However, that didn't mean to say that female agents obviously were just as susceptible to being arrested as their male agents. And it wasn't because they, didn't pass as French, that they spoke English accidentally. It was mainly because they were betrayed, that their resistance network had been infiltrated, or if they were a wireless operator, they were on air, and the direction finding vans could pinpoint the location of the transmission. So the wireless operators knew that they had to get off air within 15 minutes. So that's why during their training they were taught to operate at such high speeds. But obviously some of the agents were captured, and this is a film still from Odette, starring Anna Neagle, from 1950. Really interesting casting of Anna Neagle. She'd been she basically I think she played Amy Johnson, Florence Nightingale, Edith Cavell, and Queen Victoria. So she has a history of playing strong women, and this film is also interesting. And it's her husband, I should say, that's the Herbert Wilcox, that's the director. Possibly also explains why she starred in so many of those films. But I think another reason why this film is so interesting is all of our kind of stereotypes of the captured agent. You can see it in this early representation. So, the things that Allo and Low, for example, will play upon, and other war films will, the use of the spotlight in interrogation, the nasty Nazi that we see being deployed, the interrogator, the fact that the torturer is often a French national, some really interesting things here. And we see in this film, Odette, and again, it's true to life in the sense that Odette Sansom had a red hot poker laid on her spine, and she had her toenails ripped out. So, for the audience in 1950, watching this was really, I think, really quite groundbreaking. Okay, let's move on, and we'll kind of beginning to wrap up. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, and then I've got to talk about post-war representation. Female agents also tried to get one over the German interrogators. So one file mentioned that an informant was asked if she was really Christiane. She pretended to faint. When she recovered, she pretended to play the part of a stupid woman who'd wanted to play her glorious part in the resistance but knew nothing about it. I played the complete imbecile who knew nothing, who did not understand what it was about, who had never heard of the resistance. That worked more or less. And actually she managed to escape in 1942. So she was arrested very early on. And there was a mass breakout from the French prison, and she was able to escape. Others obviously were not as fortunate. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that these are some of the images of the female agents I started in my opening slide, and you can see, that they're a diverse range of ages. So early 20s to women in their 40s. There was a grandmother. There was a Jewish woman, or Jewish woman certainly, Denise Bloch. There is Noanya Khan, who had an Indian father and an American mother. Nancy Wake was born in New Zealand, had Australian citizenship. There was a woman from Mauritius. So a range of nationalities, range of ages. Women who were in the auxiliary services, in the WAF in particular, others that were, shop assistants, so quite a wide range. And of the 39 women that were infiltrated, if we move to the next slide, 15 of those were captured and sent to, interrogated, and were then sent to various concentration camps. One woman actually died of meningitis in France. And of those 15 women, the next slide shows the 3 women that survived incarceration. So 12 women were executed, either shot, as Violette Zabo was, or a lethal injection. And there were 3 women that survived incarceration. Odette Sansom, because she pretended to be married to her organizer with whom she was having a relationship with. His name is Peter Churchill. She pretended that Peter Churchill was the nephew of Winston Churchill. So this was her ruse, and it enabled him to be treated as a prominent prisoner in the concentration camp. She was at Ravensbrück concentration camp in solitary confinement. However, as I mentioned, she was tortured and she had a horrific experience. But when the concentration camp was liberated, the camp commandant, Fritz Suren, actually handed over his gun to Odette Sansom, and basically, so she was seen as a prominent prisoner, and he obviously hoped to reduce his sentence by showing how well she had been treated. So she survived because of her ploy. The middle woman is Yvonne Baseden, who I interviewed, who was pretended to be a local French resistance worker rather than a British secret agent. She was in Ravensbrück as well. She met Violette, who encouraged her to make it known that she was an SOE agent. She decided not to do that, and that essentially is what saved her life. And when I interviewed her, she became quite emotional thinking about the experiences of others. And then the third woman is Eileen Nairn, known as Didi, and that is the sister of Jacqueline Nairn that we saw in the film. And she was also a wireless operator, and she also pretended to be a French resistance worker. They all experienced really quite horrific things during incarceration. So Yvonne, there was a mock execution staged. Didi Nairn also experienced kind of, being beaten up. There is suggestion that some of the female agents, including Violette Zabo, were raped. So lots of these women were not protected by the fact that they were women, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let's move on to the final part of the presentation, and I'll kind of wrap up quite quickly. I just want to look very quickly at the post-war representation, although this newspaper article is actually from March 1945, so the war's obviously still going on, but this is the first acknowledgement that women were involved in this secret war. WAF girls parachuted into France. And what I really like about it is the heading, the subheading, Demure girls. The interesting thing about these girls is that they are not hearty and horsey young women with masculine chins. They are pretty young girls who would look demure and sweet in crinoline. So knowing the training that they did in unarmed combat, in silent killing techniques, and using all these types of weapons, the fact they infiltrated into France, often by parachute. Some of them, Nancy Wake that I interviewed talked about killing a German with her bare hands, throwing hand grenades into a kind of an area where there was lots of German soldiers. That's an exceptional experience, admittedly, but demure was definitely not the way to describe her experience. So that's the first representation, and then if we just look at a couple of others, a lot of the moving on to the next slide, we'll see a typical example. The focus is very much on these women who may have had an extraordinary war, going back to quite ordinary existences, and they did. These women, many of them got married and had children, and that is focused upon in these newspaper articles. So this one is Peggy Knight, who became Peggy Smith, and there's a great quote, and it says something like, "It was hard fighting the Nazis, but it was much harder being a wife and mother," and she's there pictured with her 2 young children. And the next slide, we've got, I think, some more. Yes, Commando Girls. This is a 9-part series that was published in 1950, and you can see there again Peggy Smith with her 2 children, and then you've got Odette getting married to Peter Churchill, with whom she had the relationship during the war. They both survived, as I mentioned. because of her ploy. That marriage didn't last, and she actually married somebody who was a jedba, which is another part of SOE that I have written about as well, another kind of aspect of it, male-only organisation where these men parachuted in uniform after D-Day. That's Yvonne Baseden in the other two. So one is pictured on her wedding day and the other with holding her son. So the focus is very much on these women stepping back into very conventional gender roles. So it's reassuring, I think. So these women may have been trained in this particular way, but actually they have resumed the kind of life course that would have possibly would have happened anyway if the war had happened. Okay, if we move on, there's another one there. Again, this is Yvonne, the tremendous things that happened to a quiet little English secretary. And then the next slide. This is one I think is really interesting. So this is from, I think it says 1952 at the top, Secret Heroines, Yvonne Baseden, Odette Churchill, Violette Zabo, but you might see it says Nora Khan. So this is Noor Inayat Khan, but they have anglicised her name and they have chosen a photograph of her where she's wearing Western clothing. And actually there's lots of photographs of her where she's wearing traditional Indian clothing. But obviously that was not the decision to represent her in 1952. And then if we move to the next slide, just to kind of wrap up. So female agents were, partly controlling their own representation. So we saw some newspaper articles that Yvonne Baseden wrote in the 1950s. This is an autobiography. This is the first autobiography that's published by a female agent. It happened in, I think, 1946, 1945 or 1946. So she was a journalist. She was quick off the mark. And there was another journalist called George Miller that also wrote a book immediately about their experiences of being an agent in France. But really, it's a public fascination that has meant that other people have written biographies of the female agents. And if we move to the next one, I think this is my last slide, and this is really along with Carve Her Name with Pride, this is really the most famous one. And again, I really think the front covers are so interesting, and it encapsulates, as I was mentioning about the film, the stereotypes of, this first image on the left, you've got this vulnerable female prisoner who's trying to protect her modesty and dignity, and then you've got the Gestapo officer cutting an imposing figure, looming over her, kind of stroking his whip in a quite menacing way. We also see in the second image the black uniform of the Gestapo there, and then the other two you can also see very clear, both of them set in concentration camps, and that was why she was awarded the George Cross, was because of her the way that she handled herself during captivity, not so much because of what she did when she was at liberty beforehand. Okay, so just to round up then, hopefully this has been a whistle-stop tour, there you go, third time lucky, of this organisation, which is something that has fascinated me really. Sorry, it's my dog barking in the background, since watching Wish Me Luck in 1987, which follows this story of recruitment and training, operational missions, and for some captivity, that I've kind of presented you with this evening. And I hope in doing that I've carved their names with pride. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Juliette. If people would like to sort of post questions, then please use either the chat or the Q&A button. If I could just ask you to start with Juliette, clearly Nurat Khan is Indian, and therefore I wonder, does she pose as kind of Indo-Chinese or something like that?
No, she didn't, and actually has evidence to suggest at one point that her identity did become known, so she tried to conceal the fact that she was Indian by dyeing her hair. Well, there's testaments say that she dyed it red and she dyed it blonde, which I can only imagine would actually, thanks Bill, I can imagine that would actually make her more conspicuous. And I think that's what's so interesting, that the, you know, in this period in France, we're talking about a very racially homogenous society, and therefore an Indian woman would have been noticeable. And similarly, there's lots of questions about the use of deployment of Jewish men and women, because there was a sense that, you know, if it became known that they were Jewish, then they would have been doubly persecuted. And certainly there's evidence of, well, we know that there were Jewish agents that were captured and executed. So yeah, she definitely didn't pass as Indo-Chinese. She tried to undertake the role that she was doing. She was a wireless operator, so much of the time they're kind of in a secret existence. I've got this great quote from a male agent, Ralph Buclerc, in the Imperial War Museum, where he was absolutely longing to get into action, but actually he was really frustrated. He talks about, I had a frustrated war. I was longing for action, but I was bored. And because they're the most important person in the network, because they're the link with Britain. They're the link with the wireless stations that enable them, the organisation in France, to get personnel, to get money, to get weapons. And so they wouldn't have been, they would have been protected by their organizer. So yeah, really interesting in terms of, she would have been really visible in the same way that there was a male agent who was very ginger. There were some agents that were incredibly tall. Harry Ray, that we saw in that film, his accent was clearly not that of a French national. It was, you know, it's British French. So they had an idea of who they wanted, but obviously reality is you can only choose from those that are coming forwards, and actually they had a role to play, despite the fact that linguistically or in their appearance visually they may not have been they would be conspicuous.
Okay, well, we have a question from Richard. What these women did is awe-inspiring and terrifying. When you spoke to them, did they tell you how scared they were, or how they coped with the fear they must have felt?
So I raised this with both the male and female agents that I interviewed, you know, because it was an assumption that I had, that they must have been terrified, you know, the fact that they had these false identity documents, and the knowledge was really, it was on a time lag, it was delayed. So they'd be going in with things that were out of date, that things like, you know, you would go into a French cafe and on a particular day you wouldn't be able to order alcohol. But if that information hadn't got back to Britain, then that information, they wouldn't know that. So they could stumble into something. So that is going to be anxiety producing. So I had these preconceptions that would be the case, and kind of, I guess, asked, you know, I shouldn't admit this as an oral historian, but I possibly asked a leading question because I assumed that this would be the case. And what was so interesting, there was one woman I interviewed called Lise de Baysac, and she said, absolutely not. I wasn't frightened. This, you know, I had a job to do. But then when I looked at the transcript, there were 4 occasions where she said, oh, that was one moment when I was frightened. Oh, that was one time I was frightened. And these were 4 separate occasions, which I think is really interesting. In a sense, I think there's something at stake in saying that they weren't frightened. You know, think about the representation of James Bond, that fearlessness, the bravado, So they're trying to kind of live up to that. But actually the reality was many of them were worried about their appearance or the documents. So yeah, there is that anxiety that leaks through. And I gave some examples of that in both memoirs and oral testimony. So it was definitely there, which is to be expected. And that makes them even more extraordinary in my eyes than this kind of automaton who just gets on with the role and not frightened at all.
Okay, there's from Bill. Could you say a bit about Vera Atkins?
Sure. So she was one of my interviewees. So Vera Atkins was, so there was sorry, I didn't actually go into this. So there was the headquarters staff. So Maurice Buckmaster, who I think had worked at Ford previously, was the head of F section. And on his team, he had Selwyn Jepson, the recruiting officer, but a woman called Vera Atkins was his kind of number 2. And she was originally brought in to work specifically with the female agents. And certainly Yvonne, that I interviewed, and other women did talk about Vera providing information to augment their cover stories, that would provide them with things that they could take in with them that would again kind of strengthen the story, their backstory, as it were. And Morris Buckmaster and Vera Atkins were very much the two that were driving forward the F section. She was really interesting because of her nationality. Gosh, I'm trying to think desperately now whether she's Romanian or Hungarian, and I can't remember. It's a long time ago that I interviewed her. But what was so interesting is that she refused to, thank you, Bill, she refused to talk about herself. You know, so I'm an oral historian. I want to hear about people's memories of their wartime experience, but to get to that I always try to warm them up by asking them about, you know, tell me about your upbringing, your memories of schooling and family life, and she absolutely refused to do that. And then obviously it's reading more widely, and there's a great book by Sarah Helm, a journalist, all about Vera Atkins. She was Romanian, so kind of an enemy alien, so that's kind of interesting. She's also interesting in terms of she wasn't a motherly figure, so although she worked very closely with the female agents, she definitely wasn't motherly towards them, but many of the male and female agents really thought very highly of her. And I think that's mainly because after the liberation of these concentration camps, it was Vera Atkins that went to Germany to find out what had happened to the 12 women that didn't return, and it took her a long time, and she was interviewing German interrogators and concentration camp guards to find out what had happened. And there was actually at one point there was a woman who was thought to be Norin Khan, but it was another woman called Sonia Ochonesky. So she was trying to work out what, because they just disappeared. It was called night and fog. So when they were captured and then sent into the concentration camp system, it was expected that they would just vanish. So Vera was absolutely key to finding out what had happened, and because she wanted closure for the families who obviously wouldn't know what had happened to them. Yvonne, that I interviewed in particular, had a really quite close relationship, but as I said, not a motherly one, but just a close relationship with Vera, and actually Yvonne was on This Is Your Life in the 1950s, and when I went to interview her, her big red book was out, and I'm desperately trying to think. I'm sure Vera would have been there. Morris Buckmaster definitely was there, unfortunately the recording of the television program, they used to tape over the recording, so that's been lost. But yeah, those relationships with the secret agents. I interviewed a man called Bob Shepherd. He was very close to Vera right the way through, decades after the war, would go and stay with each other. So very close friendships were forged as a result of this. So yes, thanks, Bill. That's a really great question, and I should have mentioned her.
Presumably, Juliette, there aren't many of them still alive.
No, so I interviewed Vera Atkins and Yvonne and lots of these people in 1999. I also did some more interviews in 2002. So yeah, my goodness, yeah, that is 20 plus years ago. So, and I think I was so fortunate, because I was starting my PhD, and it was at that time when these people were in their late 70s, 80s. I interviewed somebody who was at least based, that was 93, I think. But they'd come to a point in their lives when they're, I think, and I kind of feel this more widely because I've interviewed hundreds of men and women that were serving in the Second World War. They may not have talked about their experiences to their children, but they have to their grandchildren. And they saw me at the age of 22, 23 in that grandchild role. And so I really inherited all these wonderfully rich stories in a way that possibly if I was trying to do it 5 or 10 years earlier, I wouldn't have been successful. So Yvonne Baseden, for example, she wrote those articles in the 1950s. She tried to get a publishing contract. She wrote her book, her memoirs, and it was rejected by publishing houses. They didn't think it was exciting enough, despite the fact that she'd gone through all this trauma. And she told me that she basically just threw away the manuscript, which is awful, such a shame. and then just didn't talk about it. You know, I know lots of, if you look at the historical books about the SOE, you know, they haven't interviewed her. She wasn't agreeing to be interviewed. So I don't know what it was. I think my timing was just right. In 1999, when I wrote loads of letters to the Special Forces Club just near Harrods, and these letters were then passed on, I got a great response, and it kind of snowballed. So I interviewed a few of these agents, and then I wrote to them, and I was able to say who else I'd interviewed, and they all knew each other because they would have their reunions, and that kind of snowballed. And it was exactly the same with the SOE Fannies that I interviewed. That, you know, it's a close allegiance to each other, and a lot of that is centered around the Special Forces Club.
Okay, well, thank you. I particularly enjoyed the reports on them, on their training. Okay, well, that seems to be all the questions, Juliette. So I would now like to thank you, Matt, personally, but I'll now hand over to our chairman, Simon Wilkinson.
Hi, Juliette. Just to say thank you very much on behalf of everybody tonight for a stunning talk. It was really interesting and lots of information there. And nice to have the connections with, you know, the local area in Buckinghamshire. Some of those houses that you were showing us are all quite close to many of us, I think, on the talk tonight. And also a reminder for our listeners and viewers this evening that this is the last in this autumn series of talks, but we will hopefully have some more next year, and likewise some online lectures. These talks are free, but obviously running the Museum Trust is not free, and it does cost us money to run it. And if you would like to make a donation, then we would very gladly receive it. And you can do that by going on to our website, www.themmt.co.uk. And you can also join us on our Facebook page as well. And Derek posts regularly, most days, very interesting stories, all to do with Buckinghamshire Military Museum Trust. And Julia, I dare say there'll be a post about you coming up soon. I don't know whether you do Facebook or not, but you're very happy to have a look, and we would love you to join us. But thank you very much indeed, and thank you, if I may, to all my colleagues at BMMT for all the work they put in to make these things happen. I think over the series we've had many, many hundreds of people watching, so it's been great. And you know, one of the dividends of COVID has been this.